Okay, so one of the things that I like to add to this first chapter, this intro chapter, I guess, is something from a different chapter in the book. It's on pages 37 through 41. To be honest, I don't know if the PDF that I included even has that on it or not. If it's the whole book, you can access those pages and read a little bit more about that, but it's not that important because we're going to go over it all right now, right here together. So what I like to cover are some of the different research methods that are used by psychologists when they're studying psychology and doing research. So we're going to go over 4 of them. It's going to be pretty quick, but after I go over them, I'm going to have you do a little review worksheet to go back through and make sure that you can answer some questions about it and review it immediately while it's fresh. So let's start with the what I think is the most fun research method. If I was going to be a psychologist, I always say I would like to be an experimental psychologist. You'll learn what that is when you go over the profession lecture. Anyway, these are people that are doing literally experiments in a lab, just like any other scientist would, except they're just doing this in a social science with psychology. This is the method of research that is probably the one that you're most familiar with because of your science classes that you've had. This is the research method where they use the scientific method. So I've put a real quick abbreviated version. If you've taken some high-level science class, you get into the real complexities of the scientific method, but this is the basic idea here. You all remember, number 1, you formulate a research question. Number 2, you create a hypothesis. Your educated guess on what you think the answer is going to be. Number 3, the fun part where you actually conduct your experiment. That's where you're collecting all of your data, you're observing your subjects, you're manipulating the experiment itself, and then finally, number 4, you analyze the data that you've collected through your experiment. You may or may not be able to propose a theory when it's all said and done. You may or may not prove your research question right or wrong. You may or may not find out that your hypothesis was correct or incorrect. But that's the basic idea there of the scientific method. So yes, just like any other science, psychologists use this method to do their research. And there are a couple things about it that you need to know. I'm going to break it down a little bit further. And again, for some of you, this will be review if you've taken some high-level science classes. First of all, this is the one method of research, and we're going to go over 4 of them in total, but this one is the one that gives the psychologist the most control over what's going on. This is the one that the psychologist can manipulate the environment that the experiment is taking place in. You'll see with these other research methods, you don't really have that kind of control. If you want to make a really good experiment, any good experiment is going to have 2 variables. Hopefully, this is some review. You should have an independent variable in an experiment and a dependent variable. So let's talk about the independent variable first. An independent variable is that thing that is controlled by and manipulated by the experimenter. The independent variable is the thing that is brought to bear on the subjects in the experiment. I'll give you a science experiment example. Whenever I was in 7th grade, I did PJAS. Some of you have done that before. And my research question was, how does aerosol spray affect the growth rate of grass? So I grew cups of grass, and then every day I chose different aerosols. I had hairspray, spray paint, cleaning solution, whatever. And every day I'd spray some aerosol sprays on these cups of grass, and then I just observed how they would grow or not grow. So my independent variable, the thing that I was controlling and manipulating, the thing I brought to bear on my subjects, which was my grass, was the sprays. That was my independent variable. Well, every experiment has a dependent variable as well, and that is the subject's behavior in your experiment. The dependent variable depends on how the subjects react to that independent variable. So back to my grass experiment, my dependent variable, my subject's behavior. Oh, cut off there. My subject's behavior that was affected by the independent variable was how the grass grew. So my dependent variable was some grass died. My dependent variable might have been that some of the grass turned colors, it turned yellow or brown or something like that. So in a psychology experiment, you don't know what your dependent variable is until you start to administer the experiment itself and you see how your subjects react. All right, well, speaking of subjects, if you're going to make a good experiment, every good experiment has two groups of subjects. I hope this is review as well. You should remember learning about experimental groups and control groups. So in any experiment, you have this experimental group of subjects. This is the group that you're messing with. This is the group that you're literally experimenting on. This is the group that receives the independent variable. So I had a group of 5 cups of grass that got aerosol sprayed on them every day. That was my experimental group. But you should know that I also had another group of grass. I had 5 other cups of grass that served as my control group. What did I do to those 5 cups of grass in my experiment? Nothing. You just let them, well, I watered them and I gave them sunlight like a normal environment for grass to grow in. And you need to have that other group of subjects that you're not administering the independent variable to so that you can compare your experimental group to something. So your control group serves as your comparison group. It would have meant nothing if I had 5 cups of grass, I sprayed aerosol on them, and I watched how they grew if I didn't have some natural, healthy grass growing to compare it to in the end. So that's how a control group works. In an experiment, in psychology, there is a very important thing that you have to consider whenever you're creating your groups. You must use what we call random assignment of subjects. What do you think that means? It means that, well, this is the way I'll put it definition-wise. It means that all subjects in your experiment have an equal chance of either being in the experimental group or the control group. You do not pick and choose and select which subjects to put into which group. You do it randomly. Basically, you pull names out of a hat. You say, all right, the first 5 names I'm pulling out are going to be the experimental group, and then the second 5 will be the control group. Well, however you do that, it needs to be random. It just makes your results much more valid that way. Another important thing about a good experiment is that you replicate that experiment. What does that mean? That means that you do it again. So let's say you test 100 subjects in a lab, in a psychology lab. That's great. You get some results, you get some data. Guess what you should do? Test 100 more subjects. And then once you collect that data and you have more data, guess what? You should do it again with 100, and you get the idea. You should replicate it and have as big a sample as you possibly can. And there are advantages and disadvantages. You'll see all of these different methods. With the experimental method, the big advantage is that of the 4 research methods that we're going to cover, this is the only one that really helps you determine cause and effect relationships. You create a question, you do an experiment, and you can, in the end, potentially, determine that this cause, this thing, will have this effect on a subject's behavior. You will see that the other research methods don't really give you that cause and effect relationship. Big disadvantage is that the experiment is the most artificial of the different research methods. Where are experiments usually done? They're done in a lab. So it's a real artificial environment. There's always the risk that you're not getting natural behavior from your subjects, especially when you're talking about your subjects being human beings. So that is a little bit of a disadvantage. One other disadvantage is that's it. The other disadvantage is that you always have ethical issues that you need to be considerate of whenever you do an experiment. Basically, what we're saying is you can't do harmful things to people or animals whenever you're doing an experiment. You always got to make sure that you are following those ethical guidelines, okay? All right, so that's one research method. That's the one that probably takes the longest for us to get through. A second research method is something that I do quite often, actually, and on some level, and that is what we call naturalistic observation. In some ways, it's kind of the opposite of the experiment. That last disadvantage that we talked about, this idea of it's the experiment being done in an artificial environment. Well, a naturalistic observation is a complete opposite of that. This is where you go and you observe your subjects in their natural environment. So if I want to do some naturalistic observation research on high school students and their behaviors in cafeterias, I would go to the cafeteria on days where there's lunches in the old days, right? And I would simply observe all of the students eating lunch and interacting with each other in the cafeteria. That is a natural setting, and it would be very important that, should I walk around the cafeteria with a white lab coat on and a clipboard? I don't think so. I think what you need to do is make sure that as an experimenter, you remain unobtrusive. That means that your subjects cannot know that they're being observed, and why not? It's going to defeat the purpose of this whole method of research, right? Will they act natural if they know they're being watched by a psychologist? Would you act natural if you and your buddies and your girlfriends and guy friends were sitting in the cafeteria all together, all 10 of you at a table, and all of a sudden you saw this stranger in a white lab coat and a pocket protector and a clipboard just sort of watching over you? Yeah, you're not going to act natural, so you have to remain unobtrusive. Big advantage for this is the whole natural behavior thing. If the disadvantage of using the experimental method is that it's not a natural environment, the huge advantage of naturalistic observation is that you are seeing natural behavior in the natural environment. Still ethical issues though here, as there is with any of these types of research. You need to be concerned about people's privacy whenever you're doing naturalistic observation. You can't just be invading people's privacy as you're watching them in their natural environment. So, for example, if I was going to do some psychological research on students in this building, I have to get permission from all the parents of all the students whom I would be watching in that cafeteria. So there are definitely ethical issues with privacy and things you have to consider. I like to do naturalistic observation. I do it all the time. It's as simple as going to the mall and getting an ice cream cone and sitting on a bench for 20 minutes and just watching everybody go by. Now, on some level, that's doing naturalistic observation. I love people watching, so to speak. A third research method is to use a case study. Some of you may have used a case study at this point when you're doing research for an English paper or something like that. A case study is, by definition, a scientific biography of a group. Well, what the heck does that mean? It means that you choose some very specific group of subjects that you're trying to collect data on and study. So that might be people in prison. You want to learn more about what that's like. Well, what you do is you create this biography of prisoners. How do you do that? Well, you do it by collecting a combination of all kinds of different things. You're going to do naturalistic observation. You're going to take field notes. You're going to video record and audio record interviews. You're going to do therapy sessions with them. You're going to have them take tests like personality tests, IQ tests, whatever. And you're just going to gather as much information from interviewing and observing these subjects as you can. You usually do it over a long period of time, and it usually does focus on some real specific type of experience. Prison, single parent, smokers, twins. These are all subjects that might be the focus of a case study. All right, so what's the big advantage here? The big advantage of doing a case study is simply the amount of descriptive information that is accumulated through doing a case study. In the end, a case study usually results in a book that you publish, and it's like this thick. And it has every single thing in there that you learned about the smokers that you observed and you studied, or the prisoners. Disadvantage is that when you collect all of this information and all of this descriptive data from doing your tests and your interviews and your therapy sessions or whatever, you can't generalize your results to an entire population. Typically, a case study focuses in on a very small sample. Meaning you're going to study prisoners, you might select 4 people in prison, and you study all 4 of them for 5 years. Well, yeah, you're going to learn a lot about what these 4 people's life was like in prison. That does not mean that you can generalize that to every single person that's ever been in a prison. So you can't generalize your results. All right, so there you go, case studies. Anyone ever used a case study? They really are good because they create these big volumes of data and information that other people then can use to study things. So you may have even used a case study doing research, I don't know. All right, and the final research method is probably the one you're most familiar with, and that is to use a survey. A 4th research method is a survey. A survey is what you're thinking it is. You've done hundreds of surveys, well, maybe not hundreds. You've done lots of surveys already in your 16, 17 years of life. We do them here at school all the time. Basically, a survey is usually in the form of an interview, and you could do it orally, where you're surveying somebody, or you have them fill out a questionnaire. That's typically how you guys do them here at school. So the advantage of a survey, and this may make sense to you specifically, is that it is a good research method to collect information and data on what I call like taboo subjects. Things that people don't want to openly talk about. Things like religious beliefs, political beliefs, maybe your sexuality, your drug and alcohol usage, those kinds of things that people might not be necessarily forthcoming about, sharing their ideas and their opinions and their beliefs about. So you do it with a survey and you collect information on that stuff. Why can you do it if you use a survey? Because you can make surveys anonymous. How many of you, raise your hand, have ever done an anonymous survey, a survey where you didn't have to put your name on it? So the idea is if we do this anonymously, people might be more forthcoming to talk about their religious beliefs or their drug and alcohol usage or their sexual activity, that kind of stuff. But with that comes the big disadvantage, and that is you have no idea of knowing whether or not your subjects answer things truthfully. How many of you have ever lied on a survey where you're like, I don't know if I should put this down, and you just put some other answer down, right? So when you do dive into like how surveys work and the way that you analyze your data, there's a whole system to it, and there's all these mathematical formulas to account for error and to account for inaccurate or untruthful answers, but you just account for that, and hopefully you can still collect good information. So there you go. You can do an experiment. You can use naturalistic observation. You can create a case study, or simply use a survey. This is just 4 of the different ways that psychologists do their research. Okay, that's a little introduction to that, and we're going to leave it as just a little introduction to it.